Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Hamilton Project at Brookings and MAZON, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's discussion of work requirements in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, the program we used to refer to as food stamps. I'm Bob Greenstein, now a fellow with the Hamilton Project, after many years at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and before that, as administrator of the Food and Nutrition Service, the federal agency that runs SNAP. In a few minutes, you will be hearing from an expert panel. First, a few opening observations. Today, there are essentially two sets of work requirements in SNAP, one for adults aged 18 to 54 who are not raising children at home and are not classified as too disabled or incapacitated to work, and another set of work requirements for others who receive SNAP, primarily non-elderly or disabled adults with children. I would like to focus briefly on the work requirements for the 18 to 54-year-olds who are not raising children, which stand as the most severe work requirements in any program that the federal government funds or operates. SNAP did not always feature two sets of work requirements. Prior to the 1996 welfare law, a single set of work requirements applied. But the welfare law created a new and unprecedented set of work requirements for adults not raising children, under which these individuals can receive SNAP for only 3 months in which they are not employed for at least 20 hours a week, or enrolled in a qualified work or training program for only 3 such months out of every 3 years. Under this requirement, job search does not count as a work activity. If you pound the pavement looking for a job but cannot find one, you are considered non-compliant with the work requirement and are cut off SNAP at the 3-month point. The individuals who are subject to this requirement are sometimes referred to as ABODs, with the letters A, B, A, W, D, standing for able-bodied adults without dependents. But this is a misnomer. Many in this group are not able-bodied as they face various barriers to work that are significant, but not so severe and long-lasting for these people to be formally classified as disabled. You know, only about 40% of people who reported disability in census data are formally classified as disabled and receive disability benefits. I'd also note that many of the impoverished people who are subject to SNAP's 3-month cutoff have limited education, in many cases less than a high school diploma, which can make finding stable jobs considerably harder. Now, this severe 3-month cutoff provision emerged as an unexpected last-minute amendment to the 1996 welfare law. In offering the amendment on the House floor, its authors claimed that under it, if an indigent person could not find a job on their own, the state food stamp agency would place them in a work program for at least 20 hours a week, so they would not be cut off food assistance. In fact, however, the amendment neither established nor funded any such work programs, and to this day, few states operate them. People who cannot find at least steady half-time work on their own are thrown over the side. To be sure, the 3-month cutoff can be waived temporarily in areas with elevated unemployment, and it's been suspended nationally in the last 2 recessions. But large numbers of the poorest people in our country are regularly cut adrift at the 3-month point, including people who search assiduously for work but cannot find it or find only sporadic employment. Moreover, the population that is subject to this requirement is extremely poor, with average monthly cash income equal to only about 32% of the poverty line. This is the case because impoverished adults who are not raising children at home and are not elderly or classified as disabled qualify for hardly any other government assistance. They are not eligible for any federal cash assistance, with the sole exception of the Earned Income Tax Credit for childless workers, which provides an average benefit to those childless workers who qualify for it of only about $300 a year, the equivalent of about 80 cents a day. 35 years ago, these indigent individuals could qualify for modest state cash assistance in most areas through what are called state general assistance programs. But over the past 35 years, states have cut those programs back dramatically. In 1989, 38 states had such state cash programs. Today, only 24 states and DC do, and only 11 states provide any benefits to impoverished childless adults who do not pass a disability or incapacity test. Even states like Illinois, Pennsylvania, Oregon, and Wisconsin have abolished these programs altogether. In the states that still run these programs, the benefits generally are so small that they do not lift people even to half the poverty line. Most of these individuals also are unable to get any housing assistance. Fewer than 1 in 5 low-income, non-elderly, childless adults who qualify for rental assistance receive it because our rental assistance programs are heavily underfunded. These people also often cannot obtain job training that might improve their prospects in the labor market. Those programs too have limited funding and meet but a fraction of the need. As a result, SNAP is often the only benefit these individuals can try to secure to help them meet their most basic daily needs. And often they can get it for only 3 months because of these uniquely severe work requirements. So, all of this is part of why we need to take a careful look at SNAP work requirements, especially now as Congress begins to craft a new farm bill that will reauthorize the SNAP program. And to help us think about SNAP work requirements and what reforms might be made in them, we have a terrific panel. So let me turn things over now to the panel's moderator, Dr. Lauren Bauer. Lauren is a fellow in economic studies at Brookings and the associate director of the Hamilton Project. Her research focuses on social programs and safety net policies, and she has written extensively in areas such as the federal nutrition programs, the labor market, and economic security for women and children. Lauren, over to you.
Thank you, Bob, for your remarks and the kind introduction. So we are here to have a conversation about SNAP work and work requirements. And I'm joined today by 3 leading experts in this space. Ed Bolen, Director of SNAP State Strategies at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Mia Hubbard, Vice President of Programs at MAZON, A Jewish Response to Hunger, and Chloe East, Associate Professor, I'm the Associate Director, of Economics at the University of Colorado, Denver, and a non-resident fellow at Brookings. We will try to cover the waterfront, who ABODs are, federal and state policies past and present, the cutting-edge body of research evidence relevant to this policy discussion, and more. We welcome your participation. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of our conversation, so please send in your questions. As Bob said, SNAP is intended to supplement eligible households' grocery budgets to allow them to afford nutritious food essential to their health and well-being. Many SNAP participants, especially those subject to the ABOD work requirements, have little safety net to rely on besides SNAP. If ABODs are not exempt, they must successfully report that they did allowable work activities for the mandated amount of time. Otherwise, they are only eligible to receive 3 months of SNAP benefits within a 36-month period. States have a limited number of individual hardship exemptions to issue. States can choose to seek a waiver from work requirements if there is evidence of distress in local labor markets. Fundamentally, work requirements use SNAP as leverage. The theory is that exposing participants to sanction spurs work effort. But Ed, what is the relationship between SNAP and work?
Thanks, Lauren. That's a great question, and I'll start maybe by taking a little bit of a step back because I think it's important to acknowledge that SNAP doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? The folks we're talking about now and other people who could be subject to threats to take away food assistance if they don't comply with requirements are living in their communities. They're largely working in their communities when they can. And so one way to answer that question is to say, what's the relationship between workers and SNAP? And there we know that 1 in 10 workers are in households where somebody participated in SNAP during the year, the 12-month period at which a survey looked at them. That's remarkable. That's a lot of workers, right? And that's a lot of households that have a connection to the labor market. If you look at the types of jobs that these folks have, many of them are working in volatile industries, volatile in the sense that there's lots of openings, closings, hirings, firings. There's often inconsistent work hours, shift-based work, gig-based work where people are doing DoorDash or other kinds of work where they can get it. The kinds of occupations are home health care, personal care aides, agricultural workers, the food service industry, house cleaners. Those kinds of jobs we know can be tough jobs and they don't pay a lot of wages. So 1 in 10 of those folks, and in some cases 1 in 4 of those folks, are participating in SNAP at some point. So SNAP helps workers just by providing a modest assistance. Another way to look at the question is looking at SNAP households and their connection to work. And if you look at SNAP households in the population that you both, Bob and you both described, adults without children in the home, not with a disability, so sort of work-age individuals. If they got SNAP in 1 year, at some point during that year, 86% of those folks had earnings. Maybe not for the whole year, maybe for a couple of months. So they're in and out of the labor market and they're in and out of SNAP as they need to patch together some way to feed their families, keep themselves healthy, and being able to work. So that's the environment in which these requirements are sort of imposed on people. And I think as both you and Bob mentioned, the time limit is very effective at taking away assistance. Not a lot of evidence, and I think we'll talk about that later, that it helps people get earnings or jobs or increase their income. The other program, the other work requirement in SNAP, just to very briefly bring up now that we might talk about later, is essentially a training program that states can operate. They have lots of different flexibilities. One of the things they can do there is mandate that people participate in some kind of a training program, maybe job search, maybe something like that. And the evidence there is similar to the evidence around the time limit, that the main result is people lose benefits. They lose food assistance and they have a harder time feeding their families. Very little evidence that people increase their earnings or even increase their ability to find jobs.
Thanks, Ed. So I think delightfully, Chloe is going to dig deeper and pick up the ball from you. So Chloe, you're an economist who has contributed deeply to this literature. Can you give us a lay of the research landscape in layman's terms? Where are we? What do we know?
Yes, absolutely, Lauren. So to set this up, Lauren and I reviewed the literature on the effects of work requirements in SNAP this past fall and put out a Hamilton Project piece that includes our summary of what the literature finds, which I'll be describing here. And this is also a literature which I have contributed to directly myself. So to summarize what we found in our review, the conclusion is that the best research evidence very clearly and consistently shows that work requirements do not increase employment and they greatly decrease the receipt of SNAP. So this is especially concerning for what we might call the ABOD population, or as Bob rightly pointed out, that's a bit of a misnomer, but for adults who are not raising children, this is particularly concerning because by removing their access to SNAP benefits with the imposition of work requirements, we're really leaving them out to dry, since most of our other major safety net programs in the US are either not accessible at all to this population or much less accessible to this population. So this is a really striking finding and important finding, I think. So just to dig a little bit deeper into what the research says, the best studies use high quality administrative data to estimate the impacts of the either imposition of these work requirements or waiving these work requirements by being able to precisely look at changes in these requirements either over time within a single place or changes across locations. For example, one state will implement a work requirement waiver and another state will not. And so make comparisons either across time or over locations to understand the impacts of work requirements on individuals' work decisions. And this data also allows researchers to very precisely identify who is subject to the work requirements, which is an important feature of the research. So, for example, the sort of best evidence that we think is out there right now is this paper that was recently published in the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy, which is a top economics journal, and they were able to use this high-quality administrative data and documented very clearly that there was no effect of work requirements on either employment or earnings of adults, and that participation in SNAP fell by 50% when work requirements were put in place. So taken together, I think the research is actually very clear that work requirements are not an effective tool at encouraging work. And I think we can get into more in the discussion about why not only do they not encourage work, but they also are a barrier to participating in SNAP as we go. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Chloe. And Melanie, hopefully you can drop into the chat a link to the explainer. I do think one of the big value adds of that is that we really went through and read all the studies and helped prioritize, what we think is the best evidence to what we think, is useful, but perhaps not definitive. And we hope that that's useful to you. So Mia, we've been talking about ABODs as being a misnomer. Could you dig in a little more on that? Who are SNAP participants and what are we getting right or wrong about them in policy discussions?
Well, thank you, Lauren. Delighted to be here on behalf of MAZON. And, we've been working for nearly 40 years on fighting to end hunger among people of all faiths and backgrounds and pushing back on these SNAP ABOD policies that allow hunger to persist in this country. And, as a Jewish organization, we approach this work from a values-driven perspective with this idea that every person has an inherent dignity and shouldn't be judged by their circumstances, including whether they face food insecurity or struggling to find work. Every person, regardless of their circumstance, must be able to feed themselves and their families. And so I think when we ground our policy discussions and prescriptions in that kind of thinking, that's when we get it right. But unfortunately, in recent years, MAZON and our partners at the national and state and local level have been mostly on the defensive, protecting SNAP against misguided efforts to cut assistance to folks who are deemed undeserving of support. And that belief that some people are deserving or undeserving, is based on dominant narratives that we've been dealing with for over 50 years since the advent of what the welfare queen myth back in the 80s. And, a lot of those kinds of concepts are what animate ABOD policies. This idea that you have to compel people to work, even if it's in a low wage, even if it's low wage work in insecure jobs that aren't going to pay the bills, you still have to do this kind of work to get any aid from your government. And if you don't work, even if you're looking for work diligently, it's okay for certain people to go hungry. And I think this kind of destructive and enduring, set of beliefs really have normalized this perception that people's deservedness is really based on whether or not they work or not. And that kind of punitive, paternalistic approach, I think, is where we get it wrong. So, in terms of SNAP participants, the reality is that SNAP supports people from all walks of life in rural and urban and suburban communities, in every state, several U.S. territories, in every congressional district. We know that over half of SNAP recipients are not of working age. Those who are, most work. And, as Bob so eloquently described at the top of this session, SNAP recipients who are not working face some pretty significant obstacles, including structural barriers. And taking food away from them doesn't change those factors. And in fact, it only has the opposite effect of increasing hardship and making it more challenging for people to get employment. So that's why you see the anti-hunger community unified in advocating for more access, not less access to SNAP, because we know it's a highly effective food assistance program.
Thank you, Mia. I really appreciate your comments. They were quite edifying and clarifying. So I'd like to turn to each of you again to talk about, based on where you're sitting in your areas of expertise, what you see as sort of focal challenges with work requirements that are worth highlighting now. And Chloe, we'll start with you. So could you explain a little bit how work requirements, like literally the 80-hour hard threshold or any other of these minutia, interact with like actual labor market conditions?
Yes, absolutely. And this is picking up on some comments that have already been made, but I think it's a really important point. So just to kind of set the stage here, for individuals who are eligible for SNAP, they have to have income below a certain threshold. So for those who are working or have recently worked, they are somewhat definitionally working in the low-wage labor market. So I think it's really important to understand, what does the low-wage labor market look like in the US today, and how does this interact with SNAP work requirement policy? So the first important fact, I think it's really important to just echo what Ed was saying before, is that the low-wage labor market is extremely volatile and much more volatile than what we might consider, for example, middle-class jobs. And so when I say the low-wage labor market, the types of jobs you should be thinking about here are like nursing aides, janitors, people who work in food service. And in those occupations, the unemployment rate, which tells us the percent of people who would like to have a job but are not able to find a job, is double the unemployment rate of middle-class occupations. So thinking about how this impacts the ability to meet SNAP work requirements, it can be hard for individuals to find a job at all in the low-wage labor market, or keep a job through no fault of their own. It's not because of any decisions or choices that they're making, it's just the nature of the labor market that they're working in. And thinking about that hard 80-hour per month threshold that you mentioned, Lauren, that's also something that can be particularly challenging to meet, given the volatility in the low-wage labor market. So given the fact that people don't have a lot of say over their scheduling, and that scheduling can change dramatically week to week, that can be a really hard threshold to consistently meet over time, again, through no fault of the individual's own. And then the second important fact that I want to highlight about the low-wage labor market that's important for thinking about work requirements is that these types of occupations are some of the hardest hit when we have an economic downturn, and the slowest to recover following recessions. So I really think it's, unfair and doesn't make a lot of sense to have work requirements in place when there is an economic downturn and folks are not going to be able to find a job, again, not through any fault of their own. But an important point kind of beyond this and at the individual level is thinking about the economy more broadly, because we know that SNAP is a really important automatic stabilizer program that's very responsive to economic conditions. So when we see a big loss of jobs, we see SNAP automatically responding and providing benefits in response to that. But the imposition of work requirements limits the ability of SNAP to respond to these types of economic downturns. And this is particularly concerning, and I'll stop after this, because SNAP is a really effective automatic stabilizer. Folks use almost all of the benefits right away, and they spend it locally. And for example, the USDA has shown that for every $1 billion in SNAP benefits paid out, there's an increase in of $1.5 billion in GDP because of these economic stimulus effects. So hampering that during recessions is really problematic through work requirements.
Thanks, Chloe. So we'll switch now to Mia. What are the administrative burdens that SNAP participants face? Again, we're now in the minutia. How hard is it for them to get on and stay on the program?
Yeah, SNAP is a very complex program with many rules and administrative hurdles for participants to overcome in order to apply and secure and maintain enrollment. And we know that states have a lot of leeway over many aspects of the application process, so it varies from state to state. But there are long application forms, in-office interviews, extensive paperwork to verify income and expenses, reporting requirements, recertification processes. So there is a very extensive set of hurdles to jump through. And of course, the general work requirements and then the stricter ABOD requirements are a distinct burden, which impose additional activities and documentation in order for folks to prove their compliance with work rules. So the administrative hurdles for individuals are real. They are time consuming, they are burdensome. And I think one of the challenges in talking about them is to make sure that they don't just sound kind of like a technical aspect of the program. They are not an unfortunate byproduct. They are actually, they actually should be seen as an intended feature, right, of the program. We know that work requirements make it harder for folks to apply for SNAP, and they make it harder for states to administer SNAP. And on both of those fronts, it raises the risk that significant numbers of folks, even folks who are meeting the requirement or those who are exempt from the requirement, can lose their benefits. And that's all by design. And we know that there are lawmakers and states who prefer more burdensome programs and use these policies as a political tool to deter access and exclude certain people from the program. So, I think for MAZON, we're really proud to work with partners across the country who are confronting these issues in their state, both looking at how to lessen the administrative burdens for individuals, but also working kind of at that broader level to counter the legislative attacks on SNAP that we see happening and that work requirements now present. And there's a lot of variation on how states are approaching work requirements. And we know that politically conservative states that tend to be more hostile towards, safety net programs are certainly more eager to use work requirements in their programs. And we've seen states more eager to reinstate time limits now that the COVID emergency has expired. So we have states like Georgia where for the first time since 2005, they have a statewide ABOD work requirement. We have other states where the legislature has statutorily tied the hands of their state SNAP agencies from requesting waivers, even during economic downturns. We have many states where we are seeing mandates for SNAP ENT as another way to undermine access to the program. So, and of course, all of this is happening in the context where most states are struggling to just keep up with the caseloads for SNAP as they're winding down their COVID era flexibilities and reinstating program rules that were waived during COVID. So I'm thinking about our colleagues in Alaska, partners we work in Alaska, who witnessed a near administrative collapse of the SNAP program when their state terminated flexibilities much earlier than others back in July of 2022. And SNAP offices were flooded with paperwork and administrative tasks. In that state, we saw the participation plummet from 90,000 Alaskans to 30,000 Alaskans, just because of the backlog and the state having trouble keeping up. And then, of course, we have this new group of folks who are now subject to ABOD work requirements with the expansion of the age range from 49 to 54. So there's a lot going on in the SNAP program, and the drumbeat continues. We have, in fact, in West Virginia, there's a bill that's being advanced that would extend ABOD work requirements to people through the age of 59. So there are continued efforts to expand the reach and the harmful impacts of work requirements. There are administrative capacity issues at the state level, and it's very easy to see how folks can fall through the cracks and lose their benefits.
Thanks, Mia. Ed, I invite you to expand on, catch the ball from Mia in terms of sort of state level variation and where you see good and bad things, who's being innovative, in a positive direction in terms of supporting this population, and what are expanding on sort of the strategies that states are using to diminish the efficacy of the program.
Sure, yeah, and I think Mia was great to bring up the challenges that a lot of states are facing around processing applications in a timely manner, kind of doing the things they have to do just to figure out if this household that came to them in the time of need is eligible for the modest benefits. So that's like in the wheelhouse, right? It's like we need to know your income, your household composition. We need to do all these things to determine whether you can get a monthly benefit through SNAP. And that's challenging. That's right. It is a challenge for states, especially coming out of the pandemic. It's helpful to think of like, so what does doing something around work requirements mean? Then you have to identify whether somebody's work ready under the rules. You have to identify whether somebody has an exception from the rule. Remember, the one that we're talking about primarily today is this 3-month time limit. So you have to assess that almost every month, right? Because you need to know whether in a particular month somebody met the requirement, didn't meet the requirement, was exempt from the requirement, was not exempt from the. That's like a tremendous amount of work for the agency to do on top of just making sure people who are hungry get benefits when they need them. So it's a very complex requirement, that specific time limit one. Again, I step back a second and say, okay, so there's this requirement that people have to do these things. They have to be working 20 hours a week, or they have to be in training 20 hours a week. What does the state do about that? And the answer is nothing. The requirement that the individual has to work 20 hours a week, the individual has to have training for 20 hours a week. It's not that the state has to give somebody 20 hours a week or connect them to a job or even offer them a job at all. All they have to do is make sure that they are processing the applications correctly and counting these hours and counting these months under this complex rule. That actually makes it easier to cut people off. In other words, you don't want to make a mistake and have somebody get benefits when they're not eligible. That's an error to the state. The Food and Nutrition Services gets upset about too many errors, as they should. You want a well-run program, but the whole set of work provisions is really tied to figuring out, making sure people don't get benefits if they don't do these things. And so that you don't want to make a mistake in that case if you're a state agency. I think that lends to policies, procedures, loopholes, red tape, burdens on individuals to prove things to make sure they can continue to be eligible for SNAP. So the setup is bad. So you ask for like, what are states doing that are good? I can try to find those things, but it's a failing situation. And again, that goes back to emphasizing these aren't. It's not like you're finding jobs and people's incomes are improving and their overall health and livelihood is improving because of these requirements. There's no evidence that this does any of that. Plus, it puts this burden on individuals in the state to sort all these things out. So I think states that are doing a good job recognize that and realize that the reason people have come to the SNAP agency is for food. So they try to make the process as simple as possible. It is a hard job. I saw in the question and answers, somebody was pointing out that the new rules around this time limit that came into effect last year, raising the age that people have to now meet these requirements, making some very important exceptions for veterans and homeless, people experiencing homelessness and people aging out of foster care. Only 11 states had information on their website about it, according to the comment, which I believe it. It's disappointing, but not surprising. It's difficult for states to be able to process this and put this information out in a useful way. And there's no requirement that they do it. In many cases, when the time limit comes back into effect in a state, people get terminated after 3 months because the agency counted a month. But then they reapply for SNAP. why would they reapply? Because they didn't even know what it was that caused them to lose their benefits. They're still in need. They got their benefits ended. So they called the agency or reapplied and said, something happened, I lost my benefits. That just goes to show how hard it is to put these kind of behavioral requirements on people in a way that doesn't harm them additionally. If they're being terminated for failing to meet this 3-month requirement and then still turning back to the agency. I mean, most people don't, right? Most people, if they get a letter from a state agency saying you no longer qualify, they just walk away and then they struggle to meet their basic needs some other way. But for those that did come back, it's just a real sign of how this requirement doesn't do anything except create kind of churn.
Thank you. So let's pivot quickly for just a rapid fire round before we get to audience Q&A. So if you haven't put a question in, please do so. And I have a handful from prior to this to ask. But, you know, what, from where you sit and when you think about the relationship between SNAP and work, what is the one thing that you would do to improve participants' outcomes? And Ed, we'll start with you.
I think I'm not probably say at least 2 things, but one is that to just recognize that maybe the best SNAP work support in SNAP is SNAP. It's the benefit. It's the $6.20 a day that people get when they're working, when their wages are low, in between jobs, when they're looking for work, and at any other time when they need food assistance. It keeps them healthy, puts food on the table, allows them to then address the other needs in their household. A lot of these proposals and requirements ultimately are premised on this idea that the $6.20 is keeping people from working. That strikes me as an untested premise. Maybe it's been tested in the research. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. SNAP actually has a benefit structure that encourages every additional dollar. It favors earned income over unearned income. So if you were unemployed and you know, took a job but lost your unemployment insurance, it's the same amount of money, you'd be better off because you get more in SNAP. Your overall household resources would improve. It also phases out the benefits in a way that's less harmful than in some other programs. It encourages work across the line. And so I think we ought to, whatever you do, don't screw that up. Right? And then you look at the provisions we have, I think they aren't performing to any measure of success. So I think we could get rid of them. There are these training programs I mentioned very briefly. They vary widely by state. I mentioned the concern about states that mandate that people have to do something in order to keep their benefits. So they have to do job training. They have to do job search. They could do up to 30 hours a week under those rules. And usually that just results in more sanctions. But states don't have to make them do anything. They can offer programs and support to people. And we have seen some great examples of those kinds of programs throughout the country. They tend to be small. And one of the reasons they tend to be small is they're expensive. Providing support services, providing training costs more than the SNAP benefits themselves, right? So they're hard to do, but that can be a valuable thing, and it can certainly help a certain population in SNAP. And the one thing I'll just note about that is from SNAP participants, they've actually indicated that the most useful part of those training programs are the support services that they provide. And those are typically like transportation assistance and maybe childcare or some other kind of help. Basically help that you need in order to participate in the training. It's really interesting to me that they're clear about what they need. They don't maybe need to learn how to write a resume. They don't maybe need to sit in another job club or something. They need some help with transportation, and then they'll go off and find a job. So I think there are hopeful things and ways states can experiment in a way that doesn't harm folks, that helps them address the barriers that they are already facing trying to find work.
I think that's right. And a productive conversation of moving this from work requirements to work supports and making an understanding more broadly what that means for this population and what actually, you know, is required is an important area of research and understanding. Mia?
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on that. I mean, I would love to see advocates not limit ourselves, frankly, to just working on reforming and improving work requirements, policies, and really start thinking about how do we get rid of them. We know, and I mean, everything that we're talking about here today certainly rings true, that work requirements are never going to give low-income people the economic security that they are seeking and that they deserve. And anti-hunger advocates, you know, we believe people should have access to food regardless of whether they have a job, regardless of what state they live in, or what party is in power. And I think that stance, that position has been validated. We see proof in the research, and we see proof in the past. You know, if we look at during the pandemic, when folks were received cash assistance with no work requirements, they were able to feed their families with dignity and choice. And that's an environment that enables people to be able to search for jobs and improve their situation. And, you know, I think advocates pushed Congress and the Biden administration to act when we saw lines of, you know, miles long at food banks when hunger rates were skyrocketing in those early weeks and months of COVID. And they responded. They boosted the benefit, they increased flexibility, states waived work requirements, streamlined the program, and it worked. People were able to feed their families, and we saw hunger was reduced in this country. Unfortunately, those were temporary changes, and now we are seeing hunger back on the rise. USDA figures say, you know, hunger, food insecurity rates are 44 million people in 2023. And we know that families of color are disproportionately impacted. And, you know, it's shameful that we have 44 million people in this country who are food insecure, and we still have policymakers who are trying to cut them from safety net programs using policies like work requirements. So I would love for us to challenge ourselves to work toward a day where we don't have work requirements in safety net programs like SNAP. Obviously, that day is not today. We're going to have to continue to fight at the federal level, at the state level. But I really hope that we can start to socialize this idea and take steps to work toward building a safety net that recognizes everyone's inherent dignity, a safety net that's not conditioned on factors that are unrelated to need, and that provide folks with a pathway to opportunity and success. And that's, to me, a safety net that reflects the very best of who we are as a nation. And that's what we should be striving for.
I certainly agree. And Chloe, you and I wrote in our primer that, you know, the best evidence is that work requirements are not effective, reduce the efficacy of the program and the supports that to provide to families. And so, you know, we support, and the Hamilton Project policy proposals have been pretty clear in terms of what we've put out there in our own research, that work requirements are ineffective and they should go away. However, we are also quite practical people. And we understand that, you know, there's also very clear evidence about tweaks that would make things better than they are today. Do you want to talk about a few of those, and I will cover what you can cover?
Sure. Yes, I agree. So I think the most obvious thing, well, I want to start by just saying that I echo what Lauren said, that I think it's very clear that the research is strongly supportive of eliminating work requirements. It is not an effective policy towards achieving the goal of increasing work. So I do want to kind of start with that. But I also want to offer one of the alternative suggestions that we are working on proposing, which is thinking about, as I mentioned before, the low-wage labor market for individuals who receive SNAP is very different than the average labor market. And so when we're thinking about waiving SNAP work requirements in times of economic distress, that's something that we feel strongly should be taken into account. So rather than considering the average aggregate economic conditions when we're thinking about job opportunities that SNAP recipients face, we're encouraging folks to really think about what are the job opportunities that SNAP recipients themselves are facing, and what is the economic conditions, what are the economic conditions for SNAP recipients themselves, and to use those as a metric for waiving SNAP work requirements instead.
That's right. And I would add maybe two more things, but you can see a huge list of ideas in our work. So one is, and it came up a couple of times, the recently unemployed and how the safety net comes to catch them. It's something Bob raised, and it's been at the sidelines here. And the fact that job search is not an allowable activity in terms of work requirements for people who just lost their job. And as Chloe was alluding to, these are not people who get access to UI at unemployment insurance at the same rates that other people do. And so you are particularly penalizing people who were recently working, who lost their job and, are trying to get back on their feet again. And it seems particularly cruel to not allow job search to be an allowable activity for this population. The other piece that I just wanted to say is to praise Congress that, they did by hand suspend work requirements nationwide in the last two recessions. That was absolutely the right policy response. It could be made automatic, just as SNAP is an automatic stabilizer. We can put triggers into law that, allow for work requirement suspensions when economic conditions warrant, and that could be nationwide and it could be at the state level. And so I do think there are some sort of low-hanging fruit things to do to ensure that SNAP serves as an automatic recession fighter, but also acknowledges more of the realities of the low-wage labor market than it currently does. So I'd love to turn to audience questions very quickly now. Thank you so much for dropping in the chat. I think we already talked about, some of the ways in which states are or are not changing their behaviors in response to the changes to work requirements that were in the debt ceiling deal, which was the first time, other than these suspensions I just talked about, where work requirement policy was sort of fundamentally changed since 1997. So I'll go to the next one, which is, do you have guidance for messaging for lawmakers who continue to promote work requirements for SNAP despite the evidence that it doesn't work?
Could we just jump in, I guess?
Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I think calling that out is important because I think it's easy to use the words around work requirements that make it sound like it's not that big a deal and it's actually helping. In fact, a lot of the attacks at the state levels around work, the push in West Virginia, Kansas had to deal with it. Lots of states are dealing with these pushes for expanded work requirements. It's all framed as like helping people escape poverty and getting out of the dependence of SNAP. And so this is a great and helpful thing. So I think saying, no, that's not true, you can say it, but it doesn't make it true, is helpful. The research is useful just because there's a lot more of it than it used to be. I think years ago, we believed this to be true. We saw what was happening in communities when time limits and things like that occurred. People just lost benefits. Now there actually is evidence. That may not convince some people. I totally get that. But I think to the degree that that is just always called out and pushed forward is somewhat helpful. I'll stop there because I think there might be another question around that if somebody else would jump in.
Sure, and I would just build on that because the next question was, how do you use the information that we've gathered for you, either from this conversation or the variety of resources? To do that, I will say that, I think everyone on this call has spent a lot of time making very useful, documents for people to take along with them in terms of, the actual effects, who the population are, statistics you can use. And we hope you go to Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, MAZON, and the Hamilton Project to avail yourselves of all of those resources as you go forward in your communities and help work on these policies. So the last question before I'm going to turn it over to Abby, who would like everyone to know that she will tell you a little bit more about how to message this, is, what is the political landscape right now around SNAP work requirements? And, we've put some things up, but what is your ideal outcome here, whether it's in the Farm Bill or what's happening in states in terms of changes to work requirements? And I will not go first.
Well, I'll start off and talk a little bit about what we're seeing with our partners in states who are, MAZON supports advocates and organizations in the top food insecure states in the country. These also tend to be the states that have more conservative political and policy environments, and where SNAP is often under attack. And we have partners who are battling very hard at the state level. MAZON, in many instances, funding the single only full-time advocate who is in the State House pushing against these policies. And, they are, in many instances, playing defense and sometimes losing, sometimes winning. I think that making the case around these programs, there's lots of ways to go at it. I think costs is certainly another part of it. I think when we have colleagues in North Carolina who had a mandatory SNAP E&T bill come up in their legislature, and they were able to kill it based on arguments around the cost of the program, and that it just doesn't make sense. There's not enough money to implement it, and states aren't willing to put up more money to implement it. And so those are also useful ways to frame this as an issue that might be heard in a different way than maybe the research would, or the experiences of folks who are struggling with these programs and struggling to find jobs. So I think, figuring out who the messenger is also a good thing. Again, our partners in North Carolina, they leaned hard on, folks in the counties, county commissioners who were saying, look, we've got a patchwork quilt of SNAP E&T programs. This is, we can't mandate this program based on the structure we have now. So I think we really need to build coalitions with some new partners and some new voices to help us to really build the case for this.
Well, and one great voice are folks who have been subjected to employment and training programs. And I use those terms because in my experience talking with them, in almost every case, it was not a useful thing. And it was, those folks were going to find work. They had work and they were struggling. They were hustling. They were working very hard. And yet then they had to go cross county to sit in a community college, which does great work, but some kind of a setting to be lectured at about how to try to find work when they were patching together work when they could. So I think those voices are powerful because it cuts right through all the rhetoric and what lawmakers might believe they're really doing when you look on the ground and see what's happening.
That makes sense to me. And I do think part of to just wrap up our really delightful conversation, and thank you all, is do no harm. The policy in place right now is harmful. Movements toward, increasing punitiveness, making it harder to get waivers for areas that are experiencing labor market distress, making it less palatable for governors all over the place to request those waivers and be criticized for doing so, even if it's the right thing to do for their citizens. There's a variety of ways in which, anyone who's working in this space could make it easier to both avail yourselves of the tools and the safety valves that are there, but also encourage people to not continue on this route as if it were effective, because all of the best research evidence is that it is not effective at all. And so doubling down on it and doubling down on the idea that the safety valves are problematic seems to be one of the most distressing parts of the conversations that we've had in this space over the past decades, but certainly focally in the past 5 years or so. So thank you everyone so much for bringing your expertise to bear, both as researchers and advocates yourselves and the organization's work that is valuable to people who are on this call. And with that, I will turn it over to Abby to close us out.
Thank you, Lauren. I sort of knew what I wanted to say, and then I listened to everybody and I've changed my mind a little bit. So I want to start with some of the the bigger picture challenge here of trying to balance the idea that you need concrete improvement at this moment, but you can't lose sight of what your vision is. So it won't surprise anybody to hear that I want to echo what Mia articulated as a vision here, which is just to eliminate these. And when you're an advocate, I think it's really vital that you keep that in mind, that you have a vision. This is where you want to get to, and that you'll tinker around the edges here. But for the most part, we have not defined this problem. The problem was defined for us by those who are hostile to the idea of a safety net in this country. So the ideas that underpin a lot of this are that being productive is an essential American value. Now, I don't believe that's true. I think it's a cultural moray in the United States in some ways, and it's an outgrowth of capitalism. But there's such a narrow definition of productive that many people translate that, right, to solely work. So if you're not working in the paid workforce, by the way, then that means that you're not productive. If you're not productive, you have to be punished. And that's what I see work requirements. Work requirements are a punishment. They're designed that way. They're like, if you don't do this, then you're going to lose this. That's a punishment. And I know that the research here shows that these don't work. I am struck, and this in a more practical way, an argument that I would make to some of policymakers that you have to do in a dialogue, I suppose. Okay, so you want to keep these requirements here, and you're throwing off thousands, tens of thousands of people off of SNAP. Well, what's going to happen to them then? You who are complaining about the rising drug addiction problems, the mental health problems, the homelessness in your communities, do you not understand that leaving people with no food means that you are growing those populations and those societal challenges, which, believe me, the people in your community are making a whole lot more noise about than the fact that they can't even see people who are struggling with food insecurity because the safety net is there. So I think that there's this idea here that this all happens in a vacuum, that SNAP exists all by itself. And I know that Bob alluded to this fact that it's part of a larger system and that it has its roots in the time of TANF. And at the time I was running the California Women's Law Center, I was deeply engaged in arguments about TANF. And again, because it talked about the fact that if you are not engaged in paid employment outside of the home, you are not productive, that somehow raising children is not productive. Well, we can see some of that landed because we can see by the definitions about ABODs and the age range, and that there are times when we do think, okay, people are going to have a hard time finding work. No one's aging into wealth, they're aging into poverty. But the idea that these are people who are the most difficult to employ, in a sense, meaning they can't find employment easily, seems to have passed by. This is the ideas that we make and the assumptions that we make about who gets SNAP and who's on it. Seems to me that it is rooted in a system that I find antithetical to American values. When we talk about the values of this country. We talk about the values that we believe formed the basis of American values, which come out of faith traditions, including our own. And we've taken a long look at this. One of the resources that MAZON has is a virtual hunger museum. And that museum tells the story of hunger in America and the government's response to it. It's not an accident that we looked at this narrative, because there were solutions that were promulgated then that could resonate now. And it's something about political will, of course, but these same arguments were being made back in the 60s. It's sort of a myth that there was no divisiveness in politics until now. It was highly charged and divisive, and yet things landed. So I think it's worth looking back to see, what did we say then that we can say now? We know what works because of our experience during the pandemic. We understand that. How do we get back to that? While keeping in mind that we don't want these kinds of restrictions on people's access to food in this country. because it creates a country that we won't recognize. It is not who we are, and it's not who we should aspire to be. So I think we are done. Do I turn this back to you, Lauren, or are we?
You don't have to, but I will take the ball. Thank you all so much for coming. There are resources in the chat. There are resources from our organizations, but we appreciate you so much for taking the time to learn more about SNAP work and work requirements. And thank you again to Ed and Mia and Abby and Bob and Chloe for joining us. Take care, everyone.